Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Youssef Munayyer. I'm the head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar entitled Assessing the Gaza Agreement, Implementation and Implications. After 2 years of genocidal violence against the Palestinian people in Gaza, a ceasefire agreement brokered by U.S. President Donald Trump was announced last month. While it has led to a reduction in the violence and an exchange of captives, critical questions remain about Gaza's future governance and the durability of the truce. We are hosting this webinar panel to assess the Gaza ceasefire agreement, its implementation now 1 month in, and the outlook for the near future. Our expert guests today will examine the role of the United States in brokering and enforcing the agreement alongside the involvement of regional actors and Arab states. We will also explore the implications for Israeli and Palestinian domestic politics as well. Some of the key questions we will address. How was this agreement reached? Is this really a ceasefire? Who will govern Gaza? How will the different stages be implemented? And what are the interests of the various parties involved? This week, in a letter to the Israeli president calling on Benjamin Netanyahu to be pardoned, President Donald Trump proclaimed that he had just achieved a peace in the Middle East that had been sought after for at least 3,000 years. In reality, Gaza lies in ruins with no sign of reconstruction on the horizon, and Palestinians there still face daily threats to their survival. The Israeli military continues to occupy the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as well, where violence against Palestinians is at an all-time high. We are very fortunate to have a wonderful group of experts with us to talk through these questions and help us understand the situation today. For today's conversation, we'll begin with 10 minutes of remarks from each of our panelists, followed by moderators' questions and then a Q&A from the audience. Please note that you do not need to wait for the Q&A portion to submit your questions for this morning's speakers. You can send in questions anytime using the Q&A feature in Zoom or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. In the interest of time, I'll move directly now to briefly introducing our guests in the order that they will be presenting and then starting the discussion. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He's the author of the 2019 book, Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians, From Balfour to Trump. He previously served as the director of the Middle East Institute's Palestine program from January 2020 until January 2025 and was a resident scholar in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution prior to that. Tahani Mustafa is a visiting fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a lecturer of international relations at King's College, London. She works on issues including security and socio-political and legal governance in the West Bank and has a background in development and security governance in the Middle East and has worked in academia and policy. Amira Hass is an Israeli journalist, columnist, and author known for her columns in the daily newspaper Haaretz covering Palestinian affairs in Gaza and the West Bank, where she has lived for almost 30 years and chronicled daily events. Fadi Quran is a senior director at Avaz and founder of the Thiqa Initiative, where he leads efforts to reconnect Palestinian communities towards a shared strategy for liberation. A policy expert on the Palestinian liberation movement, his work bridges grassroots organizing with international policy and systems change. Thank you to all of you for being with us today. Khaled, the mic is yours for opening remarks.
Right. Thank you, Youssef, and thank you to the Arab Center for hosting this important discussion. So I've been asked to talk about the role of the United States, which of course is quite extensive and critical. The U.S. has been a key player at every stage, from providing the weapons and political cover for Israel to carry out what most experts consider to be a genocide in Gaza. Um, Two, obviously brokering a deal to end the fighting on some level, and everything in between. Um, it will be recalled that there was a ceasefire deal brokered by the United States in January of this year that held for about 8 weeks. It called for the phased release of hostages on both sides, a surge in aid. It was very similar to the plan put forward by President Biden in May of last year. And it really took both administrations, the incoming Trump administration and the outgoing Biden administration, to clinch that deal. As I said, it lasted for about 8 weeks. But it quickly became clear that Netanyahu's calculations had not changed. He needed the war to continue for his own political survival, to keep his coalition intact, and because I think the broader aims of the war hadn't been achieved, uh, which I'll get into in a moment. Netanyahu unilaterally uh, broke that ceasefire with a total cutoff in aid, really anything entering into Gaza, and a resumption of the mass bombing. And so for 11 weeks, nothing entered the Gaza Strip, eventually crossing the threshold into famine, according to international experts. In that time period between the collapse of the previous ceasefire and reaching the current ceasefire, that in that 7 month period, more than 20,000 Palestinians were killed. It's quite a staggering number, out of the nearly 70 or thousand or so that have been documented to have been killed thus far. We would have likely seen a continuation of that war indefinitely, but for Israel's disastrous strike in Doha, which compelled even the Trump administration, I think, came to the conclusion that Israel was going too far. It had overreached and needed to be constrained, and that shifted the momentum toward the ceasefire deal that we currently have. But I think it's important to point out that it wasn't just that Netanyahu violated that ceasefire. He was allowed to. He was given an explicit green light by President Trump, who, after boasting about his role in achieving the ceasefire, allowed him essentially to destroy it. The U.S. role remains obviously very critical, both in getting to these deals and in violating them. Um, in terms of the current deal, it is, I think most people have seen the 20-point plan. It is highly problematic and imbalanced. I think it clearly reflects the power asymmetry, not only between Israel and the Palestinians, but also between the United States plus Israel and the Palestinians. And so it overwhelmingly reflects Israeli demands and interests to the exclusion of Palestinian needs and interests. Phase one of the plan, I think, saw many of the same elements as the previous ceasefire: hostage exchange. The only difference is that this time they were all upfront instead of in phases. The aid surge, in fact, was supposed to be in line with the previous ceasefire deal, and much more difficult issues like disarming of Hamas, governance, and overall security conditions were put off to the second phase, which we haven't yet entered. Um, but as I said, this has been a highly problematic deal, both in the text and its presumed implementation. Instead of unlimited aid, as required by international law and affirmed by the International Court of Justice and the General Assembly, Israel is allowed, under the terms of this plan, to maintain its control over what enters Gaza and what doesn't. In essence, Israel is allowed to continue using starvation as a weapon, as most international aid organizations have, as well as several governments, including previously the Biden administration, have found. There is no mention in the plan of Palestinian self-determination. Even Palestinian statehood is referred to as an aspiration. There is no timeline for Israeli withdrawal, which is left essentially to Israel's discretion. And as we saw, a total sidelining of Palestinian interests and even agency, to the extent that the the entity that is slated to rule over Gaza is not Palestinians, not even the Palestinian Authority, but a group of foreigners known as the Board of Peace, and headed by the U.S. President Donald Trump himself. And the U.S. is trying to now codify all of these problematic elements into a Security Council resolution, which a draft has been circulated, and there are modifications being made, but we'll have to wait and see if such a resolution is able to be passed. And we see the problems with this whole arrangement kind of playing out on the ground. Once again, Israel is allowed to violate the explicit terms of the agreement, more or less with U.S. consent and with international acquiescence. Observers on the ground have documented at least 283 violations of the ceasefire over the past month. We've seen at least 250 Palestinians killed, 100 of whom were killed in a single night a couple weeks ago. Israel is continuing to destroy buildings, particularly in the roughly somewhere between more than half of the territory of the Gaza Strip. Estimates range between 53 and 58%. But Israel has destroyed at least 1,500 buildings since the ceasefire. We see aid restrictions continuing. Only about a third of what is of the roughly 600 or so trucks that are supposed to go in are actually entering. And so we are still seeing acute hunger throughout Gaza. And of course, as we'd expect, the U.S. has put itself in charge of monitoring the ceasefire, mainly through this body known as the Civil Military Coordination Committee that has members from 40 different countries and international organizations, but is essentially a U.S. military run body. We have not seen any public calling out of Israeli violations by the CMCC or by the administration. We don't know what is happening behind the scenes. I presume there are maybe some difficult conversations being had. We've seen reports that the U.S. is taking over oversight of the aid distribution from Israel, although Israeli officials have denied those reports. But in any case, we see continued American deference to Israeli wishes, and that is the point, I think, of having the U.S. in charge of this process. So I think all of this helps to underscore the importance of getting international observers, but especially international media, back into Gaza as soon as possible, both to report on the scale of destruction and also to hold the United States and American and Israeli officials accountable, since we cannot rely on the information that those governments are putting out. We need to have independent verification of what is or isn't being adhered to as far as the ceasefire is concerned. We're also seeing, as a result, a kind of de facto partition of the Gaza Strip based on this so-called yellow line, in which Israel retains control over more than half of the territory of the Gaza Strip, with a very, very small population, maybe 200,000 or so Palestinians remaining in that part of Gaza, um, even as Israel continues to systematically destroy whatever may be left there. And Israel is saying that there will be no reconstruction in areas controlled by Hamas, that is in the other 40 some odd percent of Gaza, and of course with U.S. backing. So looking ahead to phase two, I think many challenges remain. It will be the prospect of disarming Hamas, of course, is not going to be easy, especially with an indefinite Israeli presence. Setting up a local governance, particularly the idea of a Palestinian technocratic committee to oversee the day-to-day affairs of people in Gaza. It remains something that will be difficult to achieve because it requires an intra-Palestinian consensus, which has been very hard to achieve in general. We've seen more than a dozen different reconciliation agreements that the Palestinian factions have basically ignored. And so it's hard to see Hamas and Fatah in particular agreeing to the terms, and then having those terms agreed to by Israel and the United States. The Board of Peace that I mentioned, a group of foreigners, is a construct that feels very colonial, but also some of the names that are being discussed, like Tony Blair, I think are highly problematic, particularly for Palestinians. He's not well regarded across the board among Palestinians. The International Stabilization Force is another piece of this that I think is going to be very difficult to achieve. It is going to need a very clear mandate that is acceptable to all sides. The Arab states and others, I think, who are being courted as possible contributors to such a force, have real fears about becoming a substitute or worse, an extension of Israeli occupation. Israel, for its part, will not want to relinquish control or its operational freedom to any outside force. So that's going to be a very tricky endeavor to try to put those together. So I'll just close by saying, there is a very high risk that we may never see phase two. I think it's going to be very hard to get agreement on most of those different moving parts. That means that the reality that exists on the ground, including the de facto partition of Gaza, is likely to continue indefinitely. We're also likely to not see any major efforts in reconstruction, since so much of that hinges on things like the reforms of the Palestinian Authority, very vague, and maybe even unachievable objectives there, as well as the disarming of Hamas. And so the medium to long term prognosis, I think, is certainly the short to medium term, is very grim. And we're likely to see a kind of low level insurgency with continued Israeli restrictions on aid and no reconstruction.
Thank you very much for that breakdown, Khaled. We'll turn now to Tahani to discuss the role of Arab states and other regional actors.
Thanks, Yusuf. So just sort of following on from what Khaled had mentioned about or his last point about the lack of optimism, I think that sentiment has been quite widely shared amongst Arab states that have been involved quite extensively in the Gaza ceasefire. But I think for Arab states from the beginning of the crisis, their motivation has been their own self-interest and survival, and far less, about coming to a just sort of solution for the Palestinians, and more about trying to come up with some kind of peace that's viable and durable. as far as the settlement is concerned. And, in some ways, for states like Jordan, this has been especially acute. For Gulf states, especially the destabilization of countries like Egypt and Jordan has been a concern, but also the way that Israel has aggressively tried to reshape regional security. And the way that it has demonstrated its willingness to project power across the region has certainly been quite a substantive concern, especially after the assassination or attempted assassination, sorry, of the Hamas leadership in negotiating team in Doha. And I think on the surface, this really appeared to be something of a turning point when it came to Arab efforts at trying to sort of really push at that point for a ceasefire. So immediately after Israel's attack on Qatar, in Doha in early September, we saw Gulf and Arab states initiate a series of diplomatic initiatives to increase pressure on Israel through the US. So, other than the statements we saw coming out from Saudi and the UAE condemning the attacks and visiting Doha and expressing support, we also saw the emergency summit of Arab and Islamic leaders that took place in Doha, where you had Qatar's Emir calling for concrete steps to address Israel's actions and rein in Israel's capacity. But then you also saw, at least behind the scenes, a lot of disappointment being expressed. So while the optics look like this was a moment where we started to see some kind of unity of position amongst GCC states, behind the scenes, states like Qatar were actually expressing anything but, where you were still seeing a lot of the kind of power jockeying, and where states like the UAE weren't taking a firm enough position, leveraging the Abraham Accords, or trying to make sure that they didn't come across as too aggressive in their stance vis-a-vis the US, especially because Abu Dhabi at the time was trying to secure a deal with Washington regarding the sale of advanced AI chips, for example. And the Qataris were quite frustrated about that. And then that sort of preempted what we saw on the margins of the UNGA high-level week, if we recall, when Donald Trump met with leaders from a group of Muslim-majority countries in New York on 23rd of September. And that convening included states like Egypt, Indonesia, Jordan, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi, Turkey, and the UAE. And I think the thinking at that time for Qatar was that they wanted states that knew, quote, how to talk to Trump. But again, the Qataris came out of that feeling quite disappointed. And again, feeling as though these states really didn't do anything to substantially pressure the US to try and rein in Israel's capacity, or at least to try and ramp up some of that pressure on Israel. And push for a ceasefire, as well as recognition of Palestine. But what we did see come out of that meeting was things like a discussion around a new 21-point plan for Gaza, which Trump at that time had promised to deliver to Israel. And that was supposed to include a political track with the goal of a Palestinian state. But again, you had Gulf states coming out of that immediately afterwards, after the Trump 20-point plan and ceasefire agreement that had been brokered, coming out of that, speaking at least privately at length about not feeling not only optimistic, but also feeling played by the US administration and Netanyahu, because the plan that had been unveiled at the time wasn't what many of them had signed off on. And they admitted that the plan really wouldn't achieve much beyond just securing the release of hostages. And again, expressing internal kind of discontent with the position of certain Gulf states, especially the UAE and Bahrain, that really prevented a serious GCC response to that. I think it was quite interesting at the time, especially, when they were talking about some of the divergences between what had been agreed upon and then what ended up being sort of announced with the ceasefire, was that 10% of the content of that was conciliatory towards Israel. And also the frustration at the way, individuals like Kushner were trying to strong arm Hamas into agreeing to a lot of the geographical parameters. And so you had states like Qatar, for example, trying to convince Hamas not to sort of agree to that, but instead seek clarification. And the most important thing at the time for many of those states involved was just to get the bombing to stop, allow aid to go in, but make sure that there was going to be political space for negotiations to continue, as well as making sure that Saudi sort of maintains an interest in trying to see this process through. But I think generally speaking, there seems to be quite a unanimous agreement amongst the states, even after the announcement of the ceasefire, when we saw the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, again, where more substantive issues were discussed, things like a demilitarized Palestinian state, security for Israel, the decommissioning or demilitarization of Hamas. I think a lot of these states sort of echoed a very similar sentiment to what Khaled mentioned, which is a lot of the immediate but more substantive longer term issues still haven't been properly ironed out. There's a lot of reservation about the kind of role that the US is looking to sort of, I guess, impose on many of these regional states that are very reluctant to do anything that can even remotely appear to be more of an interventionist force rather than an actual deconfliction or stabilizing force. And that's something that I think they also share in terms of vision with Hamas as well, who hasn't been entirely opposed to some kind of international stabilization force or board of peace, but that cannot look like an interventionist force. It has to be more of a stabilization. And so right now, we're seeing these very regional states, trying to push for some kind of United Nations Security Council resolution, something the US was reluctant to do, but because of that kind of pressure we've seen from regional states, the US has now put forward its own draft resolution that it's cooked up with the Israelis. And I think the more substantive thing that these states really want to see come out of this is not so much the kind of, more macro issues or the more comprehensive issues around the ceasefire agreement, but what they seem to be insistent on pressing on is really what this means specifically in terms of mandate for the International Stabilization Force, because everything else is pretty much predicated on having the implementation of the ISF first. I'm going to leave it there, but I'm happy to take questions later.
Thanks so much, Tahani. I'm sure we will have questions on that later on. And we'll move now to Amira Hass, who will discuss with us the implications of this agreement for Israelis.
Thank you, Youssef. I second my thanks to the initiative, your initiative. Actually, I was baffled by this request to assess the Israeli society because the cornerstone of any assessment of this society is that we are talking about a state of collective dissociation. I can see from reading, from meeting, from observing, that there is a collective emotional and cognitive dissociation of the society from the genocidal conduct of Israel as a state and as of individuals. People know the facts, but completely are disconnected from the true deep implication of it. I'm not talking about, of course, about some exceptions that are in my surrounding. And this kind of dissociation fits well into the former states of denial of the reality that we know about the Israeli society. The most striking example, and I'm sure you all recall it, is the Israeli opposition to Netanyahu, that at some point in the years before the war, seemed to be gaining the upper hand in its refusal in its rejection of the judicial reform, as it is called. But this very opposition has consistently refused to acknowledge that there is a direct and logical linkage between the anti-democratic putsch that this government was heading, the Netanyahu's government, and the decades of military dictatorship over the Palestinians. We are all, the hundreds or thousands of Israelis who were on the left, who were in demonstrations together, were so frustrated that this obvious linkage is completely ignored or rejected or looked down or completely ignored. So within the same vein, we see that, or we saw after October 7, that this mood that, of course, refuses to connect between Hamas cruelty against civilians on October 7 and the very fact that it went out, initiated the war, and decades-long Israeli cruelty against millions of Palestinian civilians. So In that sense, things have not changed, not after October 7 and not after the ceasefire. Since Oslo, Israel has placed the Palestinians in territorial pockets, enclaves, as you all know. But it seems to me that it's the Israelis who cut their reality into pieces, into pockets, and place them in separate compartments with no connection. So one important compartment is, of course, the release of the Israeli captives that is seen by Israelis as a major goal of the ceasefire. All the rest of the ceasefire agreement, as you both said, as Khaled mentioned, is very obscure and vague. It is not credible. I mean, when I read it, it looks like somebody was trying to look for pretexts in order to pave the road for some big real estate ventures and for a salary to Tony Blair. But when it comes to the Israeli society, once all the hostages were released, the alive hostages, they were satisfied. So there is no real concern about the rest of the ceasefire. This is my impression. But then only with an exception that the return of the dead, the remains of the dead of the other captives, both Israelis and Asian agricultural workers, and Israelis are civilians and soldiers, since they were not returned immediately, you could see that the Israeli society was not, the majority was not troubled by the major Israeli attacks against, especially against civilians in Gaza, which were heavy violations of the ceasefire. There was no real concern. I mean, as usual, the public took for granted what the Israeli army said, that it was against terrorists. It fits into one of the findings of a poll just on the eve of the ceasefire, in the sense of the complete lack of concern to the Palestinian people who are here. This poll by the Center of Democracy found that the almost 3/4 of the Israelis were against the establishment of a Palestinian state. Not that this is something feasible right now, but this response tells volumes about the success of the right-wing indoctrination over the years and its actions on the ground. And by the way, in the next poll, which was just out at the end of October, around 40% said they supported the annexation of the West Bank. Of course, it shows the political failure of 7th of October on the side of the Palestinians, because it didn't bring into a realization or into a soberness of the Israeli society. It only made them more entrenched in former colonialist attitudes, former and present. About half of the respondents in a poll after the ceasefire agreed that all the other goals of the war, except of the return of the hostages, have not been achieved. So it was about more than half, between 65 to 74% believe that Israel did not realize those 4 goals. And these are the full security control of the Strip, the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, the disarming of Hamas, and the establishment of a Palestinian rule, which is not Hamas. I'm not sure that this was really a goal, but that's how it was presented in this poll. So this is quite astonishing, because the majority indeed see the whole war as a failure. But does it mean that they are against the war? No. the opposite. It may suggest or it can suggest two things. It can suggest that there will not be a strong opposition to the resumption of a war against Gaza for any slightest pretext, as we saw the attempts or the Israeli attacks after the ceasefire. It didn't have an opposition. So it makes us, and this I hate saying this, it makes us dependent on the least likely person, Trump, to keep Netanyahu at bay. We don't know how long this can continue. And these responses, I wonder, or I'm asking myself, would they suggest another direction, that the stronger opposition to Netanyahu, because he's such a failed statesman. So I'll come to it in a minute. Again, I want to stress that the whole ceasefire agreement seems very, I mean, I doubt the seriousness of it. While it was formulated and while it is being implemented. But there are some hints here when it comes to not to the goals or not to the phases, but to the dreams or aspirations. So things that are very basic, like the right of Gazans not to be expelled from Gaza. It looks completely crazy to mention it as a right, but after the 2 years of heavy campaigns on the part of the Israeli right wing, calling for expulsion, or as they called it, willful emigration, or this relocation, then it looks like that they are not succeeding in their goal, the right wing, to force Palestinians to sign, for example, on a paper they will never return. There is another mention in these articles, vague articles, about a state. What's interesting here, that it may suggest a connection between Gaza and the West Bank, and this is after many years that the Israeli policy did succeed in disconnecting Gaza and the West Bank. And of course, the politics of the Palestinian politics for years has deepened this Israeli policy. The discrepancies between Hamas and Fatah, of course, strengthened the Israeli policy and assisted it. But these basics, I cannot even call it right, but these basics mentioned in the ceasefire articles, if you do read between the lines, have nothing to do with how the Israeli society relates to them and to the Palestinians. There is an ongoing massive expulsion, waves of expulsion of Palestinians that are taking place in the West Bank. It's not yet, or I wouldn't say not yet, it is not about expulsions outside of the country, but it is expelling them from their lands, and both done by settlers and the Israeli government. One of the most atrocious things is that the way that Israel has barred Palestinians who have land beyond the separation barrier, has barred them from reaching their lands during the last 2 years. And now it allows them to reach their lands for 2-3 days for picking the olives, and the olives are hardly there or hardly useful. So, and the general Israeli public doesn't care about it. I mean, the attacks are going on. Okay, there were some outcries because soldiers were attacked, but in general, this continues, and also continues the establishment of new outposts. So, and this on top of the fact, as I said before, that the majority already objects to the idea of a Palestinian state. So, of course, it does not disturb this violence does not disturb. And everything that Khaled mentioned also concerning Gaza and the Israeli continuous actually blockade over Gaza, and the fact that one needs so much more in order to assist them to rehabilitate and to rebuild their lives. This doesn't exist at all. So this is not a concern of Israelis. So, um, so even though a great major, I think a solid majority of Israelis really think that this government is a failure, and that these last 2 years were the worst in Israeli history. The messianic right-wing groups who think that it was a miracle and that these 2 years were great are a minority, but in a way they do show that their way is taking over because so few Israelis really oppose them on that ground. The ceasefire, on the one hand, exposes the weakness of the government, but at the same time, you don't see, we do see that the Israeli government excels at using those failures and excels at using the war and the grief and the losses to even consolidate its rule and to continue with the judicial reform. So I think that they are very good. I mean, they're talented at doing this, the Israeli government and Netanyahu and his people, and certainly the people on the messianic or religious right wing. They are very good politicians and executors of their policies. But a great reason for this is that the Israeli opposition has proven that it is not an opposition at the most basic element, and this is the policy towards or against the Palestinians.
Thank you very much for all of that, Amira. Before we turn to Fadi to round us out here, I just want to remind everyone viewing that you can submit your questions for our panelists today through Zoom's Q&A feature or via email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And Fadi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yusuf, and I want to also thank the Arab Center and all the speakers before me for giving this space and clear presentations that allow us to understand better where we are at this moment. What I want to speak to in the context of the broader dynamics of the ceasefire within Palestine are four key points, which is the sense that we have gone from a full-fledged genocide by fire into a process of politicized. And what I mean by that is the destruction of the Palestinian ability, which is an ongoing process under apartheid, but to the destruction of Palestinians to control their destiny, to define how they govern themselves, to democratically choose who governs them. And it seems like this plan that was put in place is designed to basically further fragment and kill the ability of Palestinians to be political agents in their own destiny. The second thing that I want to name will be connected to how those who killed or profited from the killing of Palestinians are being placed to actually be the ones that also profit from rebuilding. And while we're not even talking about reparations, which is another dynamic that should not be ongoing and is tragic. And the last piece I'll speak to is how this ceasefire and what's been happening after that is seeking to re-engineer Palestinian society. There's a level of socio-engineering that's happening. Before I go into those details, I do need to name that I think every Palestinian and every person that has a bit of humanity in their hearts felt a sense of relief when we heard about the ceasefire. And that was the feeling, of course, in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and other communities, because people were watching a live genocide. And consequently, even when you speak to your friends and they're getting a meal a day instead of struggling to get a meal a week, you feel a sense of relief. even, and the fact that we've went from an average of 100 to 200 people killed per day to 20 people killed per day, there is that sense of relief. But unfortunately, what has come into place since the ceasefire agreement is this idea that the Trump administration, with the Israelis, with even some of the mediators, are actually engaging in an act of strategic deception. So this isn't really a ceasefire, it's a strategic deception that was meant to basically take attention away from Gaza and what's happening in Palestine and allow them to allow the Israelis, at least with US support, to attempt to achieve with bureaucracy what they failed to achieve through genocide and bombing. So let's kind of go to some of the key frameworks here. The first is when I say going from genocide to politicide, I don't mean this in a like broad abstract framework. Some of the key aspects of this plan first of all, where will power lay in Gaza? And it's this Board of Peace entity. For those of you who have read the Blair plan, I think it was leaked, but basically he details in that plan and Trump took from it what this Board of Peace is attempted to achieve. But it's a body that would be chaired by Kushner, after Trump, of course, Kushner or Blair. I actually heard one of the tensions that are existing right now and moving this forward is the Kushner versus Blair tension on who would be, leading and executing in this body. And then you have a UN official. Then you have Arab businessmen. I heard that Suarez from Egypt was asked to join and be on the board. And then a Palestinian fig leaf for this body. And this body would be capable of making and holding one of the key decisions in the rebuilding and reconstruction of Gaza, which is how the money flows. So de facto, you have a body that has no Palestinian power, no Palestinian agency within it. Where do Palestinians come in? They come into this technocratic governance body. And this is going to be a significant challenge because there have been 40 names that were suggested by the Palestinian factions to the Egyptians. There was some tension because the Palestinian Authority wanted everyone to agree that whoever heads this technocratic body built in Gaza would be a PA minister. That's been agreed upon right now. But there's still tensions regionally because, of course, the Emirates would like somebody more closer to Dahlan to be playing a more significant role. There's talk of Nasser al-Qudwa. There was talks of the head of the Palestinian NGO network on the ground. But the truth is that this bureaucratic body, if the ceasefire plan is executed as it should be, will not have, and this is why they want it to be technocratic, will not have any significant leverage in deciding the most important things about rebuilding. There'll be an executive body where most of the decisions will be made through this Board of Peace and through the US, and of course, with an Israeli green light, which is what we're hearing then is in terms of what the Israelis and Americans are thinking in relation to this is creating two Gazas, the Gazas outside the yellow line and the Gaza inside the yellow line, with a broader design of what I would call genocide by attrition, is that either people can choose to leave and be forced out of their homes and key urban areas that are crucial to them into this area where, camp cities will be established. They'll call them temporary areas, etc. But essentially, Palestinians will be socio-engineered to move from parts of Gaza to another part because that other part is going to have most of the investments in rebuilding. And of course, who will do the rebuilding and what companies? And this is another issue, is all the talk that's happening behind the scenes is a lot of the resources, a lot of the necessary stuff will be bought via Israel or through contractors connected to Israel. We have news in the West Bank, unfortunately, that even President Mahmoud Abbas's son has come out and recently signed and registered a construction company. You can guess why he would do that. Then you have the Egyptians inside the military, of course, and the different individuals within Egypt that profited $5,000 per person just for moving Gaza out are starting to put their plans so that they'll go into and rebuild Gaza. And in all of this context, in all of these details, nobody's actually asking, what do the people of Gaza need? What do they want? What do they legally deserve? I mean, the conversation around reparations has not been brought up. It's not mentioned in the ceasefire plan. It's not mentioned in the Blair plan. It's not mentioned elsewhere. Now, this takes me to the other part of, this plan that claims that once this body is established and it, stabilizes Gaza, and you have this international force, etc., that the PA, once the PA completes its reforms, the PA will then be able to come in and govern Gaza. I mean, how many times will we need to live this joke again and again? Salam Fayyad was told, once you finish your reforms, we will give you a state. And the guy basically sold out everything to finish the reforms that the World Bank asked of him, and he got nothing. Before that, Oslo, we were told, once the PA is ready to become a state, we will give you that. It's the same film again and again. But what happens in between as this, film and theater rolls out? Palestinians are further fragmented and Israel further increases its control over Palestinian lives. But what are the reforms that the PA is being asked to? And this is, quite humorous because before any Palestinian citizen has seen the constitution that the Europeans, particularly Macron, has been asking the PA to produce, Macron got to see the constitution. So, and President Abbas has a constitution that he's had his secret committee work on. Before any Palestinian saw it, he went to show it to Macron and brag about it. Macron and the Europeans and this reform plan also includes a new political party law that they want President Abbas to establish. But what's included in this political party law? Again, a law that no member of Palestinian civil society has seen, but that the French paid a guy to draft on their behalf. And this is part of the French-Saudi plan. Well, the political party law says that you can't establish a political party unless you agree with the PLO's political positions and principles, aka you have to agree with Mahmoud Abbas. You agree to Oslo as a framework, and you agree to all of the detailed promises that the PLO has made. De facto, even Mustafa Barghouti couldn't, establish a political party and form this. And he's the most non-violent, Western-friendly face in Palestinian politics. So de facto, the French want to establish a political party law as part of our reforms that only allows Mahmoud Abbas's clones to run in Palestinian politics. The other dangerous part of this is then how are the individuals being chosen to run Gaza in this kind of technocratic body? And this is currently a significant battle right now between different actors. But what we're seeing everybody lean on, because it feels like it's the easiest way out, is that it's Palestinian businessmen. So it's essentially won't be people with Palestinian political knowledge. It won't be people with any type of grassroots public support. It won't be people connected to communities. It will be people from a very elite strata of Palestinian society. So you could imagine the government of the US being chosen from the, top 1%. So you'd have Elon, Mark Zuckerberg, you could choose from like those 10 people, Jeff Bezos. I mean, it would be a joke if it happened in any other country. But in Palestine, of course, people want to test their technocratic dreams and illusions on our people. But this is also problematic because you'll be choosing business people from the Palestinian society that have their businesses. Basically, you can't run a business in Palestine unless you are collaborating with Israel or unless you're keeping Israel happy. So you have people running and governing Gaza who have a conflict of interest with the Israelis or with Arab regimes. If they're Palestinians in other places like Jordan or the UAE or etc., they'll have conflict of interest with other regimes. So this is again a form of domination that's being imposed on Palestinian politics. And we see this happening also in the West Bank, just to name, where Israel's allowing new individuals to rise through giving them easy economic access. So you have a broader socio-engineering of Palestinian society where only those who are, let's say, compliant with Israel's demands are allowed to make money, and thus only those can employ people, and thus they build significant social capital within society. And this takes me to the last piece I want to speak about in relationship to how the ceasefire is unfolding, which is right now the big question on the ground in Palestine, both the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere, is A, how do we survive the onslaught that we're facing? How do we stay steadfast in the face of that? As Amira mentioned, settler attacks in the West Bank. In Gaza, as Khaled and Tahani mentioned, people are still starving, aid is not getting in, etc. But beyond the question of survival is then, can we get out of this without rebuilding a completely new Palestinian political liberation movement that is not one that is tied to or complacent with the status quo? Because it is clear that if it's President Abbas's government and the people around him, they're not interested in, they're working on their survival, so they're willing to bend over backwards and do whatever the EU and US ask from them. Hamas is very significantly weakened. They very significantly are in this place where they're isolated and their level of influence within Palestinian political spaces are less, and the other parties are almost not present. So this is the crucial question is, are we going to face a situation where you have a new Palestinian leadership and framework rising out from Gaza, from people on the ground? What's that going to look like? And also from the West Bank, and then are Palestinians going to be able to, this onslaught of fragmentation and politicide that they're facing, are they going to be able to come out of that and create something that unites them and moves them forward? Because Palestine continues to be an issue that has built massive solidarity across the world. Everybody's feeling the ache of the genocide. And trust me, if you've lost a child or if you've seen children's lives being lost on TV, you're not just going to forget about that and go back to your normal life. You're going to pursue justice. You're going to seek dignity. You have a whole generation, over 60% of Palestinians under the age of 35, that have been scarred by this genocide and that won't be healed by Blair and Trump's Board of Peace. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Fadi, and really to all of you for your very incisive and excellent breakdowns. I have a few questions for you all, and we'll kind of mix these in with questions from the audience. Khaled, I want to start with you. You mentioned that this thing may never see the second stage. This agreement may never see the second stage. I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. And when I initially saw this 20-point plan or whatever it was, the first thought in my head was, Netanyahu's got a history of taking one 10-word sentence in an agreement and finding three reasons not to move forward with something. And the kind of field day that he would have with the 20-point plan, especially when we know that the Americans repeatedly give the Israelis veto power over so many things historically and today, the prospects for this actually getting implemented are slim. So far, the Americans have shown a degree of attention and commitment early on, but it's not clear that that's going to last very long. If this does in fact get stuck, what does Gaza look like? What happens next? And what can we expect from that? If you can just briefly respond to that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, as you said, there's a high probability that just things won't move. Part of the problem is there's an enormous attention, investment, and interest gap between the United States and Israel, in the sense that the Israelis are heavily invested in everything that happens in Gaza, in addition to being, of course, very much in control. their attention is very much focused on Gaza, on the minutia of everything that happens in Gaza. And of course, they're sort of in a state of being, they're perpetually seized of the importance of this. For Donald Trump and his administration that lack basic knowledge and capacity when it comes to this issue, and are, especially for Donald Trump himself, who's sort of interested at, at top line levels of, the headline of a peace deal or of a ceasefire. Beyond that, he's not really interested in the details. Even his military people on the ground, I think, are not as interested or as knowledgeable or as invested in the details. They're certainly not invested in Palestinian needs and interests. And so there will be automatically this not just deference to Israel, but really Israel's uh, interpretation of the agreement, implementation will be the de facto reality. I mean, this is we're already seeing this on the ground. The United States simply doesn't care as much as the Israeli side does about everything that's going into Gaza. And of course, they're not listening to Palestinians. They're barely listening to their Arab partners. But this is where I think, the picture's already been painted, I think, by all of us of what Gaza will look like. It will look like what it looks like now, ongoing death and destruction, but at a smaller scale than we saw over most of the last 2 years. Continued starvation, lack of reconstruction, lack of movement on any political front. Of course, the West Bank also continuing to deteriorate. So all of those trends, I think, are just going to continue. But where there is real possibility for movement, I think, is from the Arab states. One interesting thing that hasn't been mentioned at all, is the Arabs put together, headed by Egypt, a plan for the day after in Gaza, a very detailed plan in response to, remember, about way back in February when the president was talking about, Gaza Riviera and basically ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. And so the Arab states sort of scrambled and put together this plan. Nobody talks about that plan anymore. Where is the Egyptian plan now for the day after? Why is that not even referenced in the 20-point plan or in the US draft for, did the Arab states also abandon their own initiative? I would think the Egyptians especially have a stake in doing that. And so I think this is, the Trump administration doesn't care about Palestinians or their needs. It doesn't recognize Palestinian agency. To the extent that they're going to accommodate any Palestinian interests, it will have to come from the Arab states. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Qataris, especially. And so, where are they? Are they going to allow this non-ceasefire implementation to continue under the cover of the Trump plan, and everybody wants to kind of look the other way, or are they going to call it out and use the leverage that they have? That is, I think, the open question in my mind.
Thank you very much, Khaled. Sort of following up on that point, Tahani, I wanted to ask you, when we saw the big signing agreement where Donald Trump declared the end of 3,000 years of conflict in the Middle East, flanked by all of these global leaders, many Europeans and leaders from the region as well, seated next to him was Erdogan of Turkey, leaders from Qatar as well, who played a really prominent role in kind of mediating the situation. And the Turks, particularly late on in the game, came to play a larger and larger role in the agreement and also its implementation. Sort of absent were the Saudis and the Emiratis, who had a lower level representation there. Can you talk a little bit about sort of differences between these two different groups of countries and how everybody sees the role of the International Stabilization Force, the ISF, and what the different concerns around that are for the countries who may be called upon to play some sort of role in it?
I mean, look, I think there's definitely been different motivations amongst these countries for why they've been trying to push for a ceasefire. I think where the convergences have been in the recognition that there needs to be an immediate stop to the bloodshed. I don't think any one of these states is under the illusion that phase two is a real possibility, even the Turks themselves. They have really at least behind the scenes, they've admitted to treading with caution around the prospect of a phase two. But again, the priority has been to stop the bloodshed. When it comes to the Saudis and the UAE, I mean, I think I touched upon sort of the UAE not sort of leveraging its capacity to pressure the Americans or to pressure Israel vis-a-vis the Americans and the Qatari frustration around that precisely because of the sort of kind of logistical and economic relationship specifically around that time that they were sort of trying to protect with the US. But when it comes to the Saudis, I don't think the Saudi motivation has really shifted post 7th of October. They're still adamant on the prospect of normalization with Israel. The problem has been that Israel has managed to torpedo that process at every turn in the last 2 years. So the optics of that, especially for their public, where public opinion has so substantially changed post 7th of October, has made it harder to sell the concept of normalization to their own people. And that's been really I think the thing that has sort of pressured Saudi into trying to push for some kind of concession vis-a-vis the two-state solution based on the 1967 borders and land swaps and the recognition push that we saw. But a lot of that being motivated around Saudi wanting to eventually come back to the issue of normalization. And there definitely has been a lot of open frustration, I think, being expressed by Saudis that I don't think we really saw pre 7th of October, and especially since the attack on Doha. But even in mid-October, I think there was a bit of a change in terms of the sentiment around the ceasefire agreement. I recall like in early October, the Saudis seemed somewhat kind of optimistic around it. They admitted that it was a really, good basis for rebuilding Gaza and peace, but it's not going to be a quick and smooth process. And that's made even harder by the fact that no one really trusts Israel, especially, the GCC states now. But it definitely offered what they described as an opening for rebuilding and bringing aid into Gaza. And then suddenly, sort of in mid-October, we kind of saw that sentiment shift and the Saudis sort of admitting that things were still very unclear, undecided. After the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, there had been sort of a consensus amongst those states that were there that certain things had to be done, things like a demilitarized Palestinian state, security guarantees for Israel, a demilitarization of Hamas, no future for Hamas in Gaza. And as a result, the need to kind of support some kind of alternative governance mechanism. And I think at that point, they were sort of in agreement that maybe the Board of Peace, for lack of better alternatives, might be the place to start funneling some of their sort of thinking and resources into and support, as well as obviously the need to link Gaza and the West Bank rather than thinking of them as two separate administrative, institutional, and geographical entities. But then they also admitted, I mean, this was from Riyadh's own perspective at admission, that there was still a lot of gaping holes, things like, Israel continuously undermining security and law and order in Gaza through its proxy gangs, the fact that Netanyahu is looking for any kind of pretext to continue its military operations, the fact that Rubio at the time and is still insisting that there's no Palestinian partner for peace, which is why the Saudis since have been trying to prevent any kind of fall or collapse of the PA by finding ways to sort of continue funding streams to the PA, pressuring the PA for reforms, which they've faced a lot of blowback, I think, because of that, where the optics again are not very good when you have a state like Saudi trying to push the PA for democratic reforms. And then again, trying to make sure that the PA is conforming to the reforms that the US themselves have insisted upon. And what was, I think, even more interesting is the fact that all of these states are unanimous in echoing what I think a lot of the other speakers have mentioned, which is the absolute absence of the Palestinians in a lot of this thinking, in a lot of this planning, not just in terms of them having any input in these processes, but also any envisionment of a future. And more importantly, how a lot of these plans, whether that's the UNSC resolution that the US is about to put forward, or even this 20-point plan, really doesn't leave any actual space for any prospect of a Palestinian state.
Thank you, Tahani. Amir, I wanted to come to you now. You talked about the disassociation sort of in Israeli society with the genocide and so on. October 7th, of course, was a day of very, very significant losses for Israel, in many ways unprecedented. And this did not come, of course, from the Egyptian military as it did in decades past. But it came from a Palestinian faction that was bottled up in an open air prison and under sort of the constant monitoring of the Israeli military. And after 2 years, we've seen, obviously horrific bloodshed in Gaza, but also significant costs paid on the Israeli side, both in terms of soldiers that have been killed, a reserve force that is, very exhausted, a unprecedented suicide crisis among Israeli troops, an economy that has taken significant losses from all of this, global standing that has never been lower, and a leadership that's been indicted for war crimes in the International Criminal Court. And after all of this, the fundamental equation does not seem to have changed. The Palestinians are still there. They're not going anywhere despite this genocidal violence that's killed perhaps close to 100,000 or more Palestinians in Gaza. And as you know, there doesn't seem to be any interest in an alternative vision for a different kind of arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians at all. How can this be? How are Israelis imagining a future in this space if there's no fundamental change in their relationship with Palestinians? Amir, you're on mute. Sorry, we can't hear you.
I am afraid that still a great part of the Israelis still think that mass transfer is a solution. I cannot say how the numbers, but you talked, Fadi, about social engineering. It's very strong in the Israeli politics, the idea of social engineering that will come to maybe other stages or other places, not necessarily, again, repetition of the genocide in Gaza, but really mass expulsion to Jordan, who knows? I mean, we see how the Tahanist right-wing groups are strong in this society. We have a head of Shabak who is one of them. We have now a new military attorney general, or who is one of them. We have the chief of staff who is almost one of them. So they are strong. They are very strong in that sense. Yeah, the Palestinians remained. But let us not forget, from what we know about Gaza, many people dream of leaving. If they had the chances, if they had the money, if they had the visas, they would have left, because we don't see a prospect of real, as you all mentioned, real reconstruction that takes into account the will of the people, not the will of real estate moguls, but the real needs of the people. So this is very tragic. It's not the losses of Israel doesn't mean that the Palestinians people's defeat under this terrible war is not there. So how
Can,
would
can I
we
just push you on? Can I just push you a little bit further on this question?
Sure.
I hear you completely that there is a contingent that probably believes that further ethnic cleansing is a solution. It's not just possible, but it's a solution. But I do wonder though, like the history of this relationship, we've seen many times where Palestinians have been scurried over the next frontier, and that has not
No,
led
we're
to.
not talking about look, I'm not, first of all, I'm a very conservative journalist. I don't like to speak about, to prophesize about the future. I see, of course, Palestinians have, I mean, Palestinian steadfastness is not a slogan, it's something very real. But we see now with we see them now in the past 2 3 years, the way that Israeli fascist groups managed to expel about 60 communities, and there was no international uproar, and nobody was really able to protect them. Neither the Palestinian police nor all those armed groups that did what they did in Jenin, in gathered or whatever, and got their weapons from elsewhere. They didn't come to the support of the people either. I don't think that with arms would have done anything, but I didn't see mass of hundreds or thousands of Palestinians coming to the rescue of shepherd communities, herding communities in the Jordan Valley, and bring them back. So we do see it's part of this also fragmentation of the Palestinian society, and the feeling that you don't have anybody really standing aside them and supporting them really who is capable politically. But in Israel, this what troubles me now is that this goes on in Israel, and the radicalization of society. And when you talk to younger people, this is frightening. This is really frightening. How this can be stopped? I saw there is one of the questions. Of course, only international intervention. I mean, political intervention, sanctions, etc. But we don't see it happening now. And of course, I think that also what you hinted at, there must be, the change cannot come from the Israeli society. The change can come by completely shuffling of Arab and Palestinian politics. Is it also, do I, you would say that I'm putting the responsibility on the subjected or subjugated people. But unfortunately, the subjugated people has the interest to change. Israel doesn't seem to have an interest now to change in that respect.
Thank you, Amira, very much. Fadi, coming to you now. You talked a lot about the reconstruction issue, who might benefit from that, and the fact that Palestinians have entirely been excluded from the process of talking about these things. But before, at least as far as the plan is concerned, before reconstruction begins, there has to be this ISF thing that is implemented and put into place. And I'm wondering if you can share with us your assessment of what Palestinian views are towards this ISF. We've heard a lot about why other countries may not want to be part of it or would only want to be part of it under certain conditions, but we haven't heard much about what Palestinians feel about something like this. What would they want it to do? Who would they possibly accept, and under what terms participating in this, and so on?
Thank you, Yusuf, for that question. A few points to name. The first is in relationship to the ISF. There have been a number of Palestinian petitions, letters coming out and being signed, oftentimes by people who are politically engaged, by people in political factions and outside of them. And they've all had one main message, which is they don't want a militarized force to come and basically run Gaza and control their lives with a mandate to protect Israel, or with a mandate to disarm Palestinians from being able to defend themselves. There's, I would say, a blanket agreement across all of Palestinian society that any force that is being sent in to protect Israel or being sent in to do Israel's bidding, etc., is not acceptable. So that's just the first line. Now, the high line, the threshold of what Palestinians want, is de facto a force that is going to come in and protect them from Israelis, and essentially ensure that the Israeli army moves out of Gaza and is pushed out of Gaza, including from the areas that they currently, of course, control, the occupied, the areas beyond what's called the Yellow Line right now. We need to remember that Gaza is all de facto occupied under international law, and it's been that way even before October 7th. The the other piece of conversation is then it's going to depend on if this stabilization forces coming in to protect Palestinians, coming in to ensure that the Israeli military is out. It needs to be a force that people can respect and engage with. And this is why people have more affinity, let's say, whether it's Egyptian forces or Turkish forces, etc. I mean, the Arab Gulf countries, they don't really have large militaries that are capable of engaging in something at this scale. Maybe Saudi Arabia, but other than that, the final thing I'll say about this stabilization force is that I think one of the crucial conversations that is happening within Israeli society about this, and definitely is being talked about within Palestinian society, is people feel without a doubt that if the forces come from countries that are Arab or Muslim, including if they're even from Azerbaijan, a lot of the soldiers, this is the expectation people have, once they see Israel's insolence, a lot of they're normal people who've been watching a genocide for 2 years. There's this, and maybe it's too hopeful, too hopeful of wishing, but people expect that these forces may eventually clash with the Israelis on that sense. And I don't think anybody would be surprised if an Egyptian soldier, I mean, we saw that multiple times during the war, or an Indonesian soldier, even a Saudi soldier, were to at some point be so provoked by the Israelis that they'd began firing at them. I mean, it takes someone with inhumane patience and a high level of indignity to be able to handle engaging with the Israeli military and how insolent they are. So this is another thing that's just within the Palestinian psyche. I want to also add just to a point Amira mentioned, which is there is the necessity of Palestinian agency right now for sure. Um, and we need to understand, and there have been attempts at significant Palestinian agency, both political and also in terms of those who have been engaged in armed struggle. And some have tried to help, whether it's the farming communities, whether it's the people attacked by settlers. But of course, the calculation whenever that happens is that the Israeli response is more severe. But it's not like there haven't been attempts on that front. But what I think everybody needs to understand watching this is there is a project that is being led at the highest level right now of the Israeli military and Israeli political elite, which has very clear goals. And that goal is the complete erasure and subjugation of those that remain of Palestinians on the ground and full control of all the territory between the river and the sea. That is the Israeli project. Now, wherever they can achieve it, wherever this Israeli political leadership and elite can achieve that goal, they go after it, whether it's in Khan al-Ahmar, whether it's in the Jordan Valley, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Rafah. Everybody needs to understand that that is the project that Israel's run by, and they change their tactics based on what obstacles they face, whether those obstacles are Qatar or Trump or whoever. but that is their project. And there needs to be on the other side of that a project for the liberation of Palestine, not just a project to survive, because no movement in history has ever pursued survival against a settler colonial regime and succeeded if their threshold was survival. The threshold needs to be liberating and ending the domination of the other side. And my sense is this is what's going to be playing out on the ground in Gaza, no matter how this plan unfolds, in the West Bank, and in global politics elsewhere. And people have to make their choice. Are they with the Israeli project of erasure, or are they with the Palestinian project for freedom, justice, and dignity? It's become as simple as that. And going around that is a failure for all of us as analysts because we complicate things that shouldn't be as complex.
Fadi, can I just ask you to expand on that last bit for a bit? Mahmoud Abbas is somewhere above 90 years old now. I've lost track. He's appointed his deputy, Hussein al-Sheikh, as his sort of number two, very much within the same mold. I think, survivalist would be putting it kindly. How widely shared is the assessment that you just described among Palestinians that you speak to, that you work with? Because it clearly does not seem to be the vision that is being followed, if we can speak of it as a vision of the leadership in the West Bank. How widespread is the assessment that liberation, not survival, is the optimal project at this time?
That's a great question. And we've been actually running kind of internal polling and conversations and focus groups to understand this in depth, because of course the answers that you'll get right away from people will differ than the deeper conversations you have from them. The truth is that everyone, when you start speaking with people, everyone's sense of what's possible is only survival. And it's important to name that they don't think that President Abbas or Hussein al-Sheikh are even pursuing a survivalist strategy for Palestinians. They see them as pursuing a survivalist strategy for their administration. And so that's why Hussein al-Sheikh in polls has like 3% of support in Palestine. Like nobody wants this guy, except the people who are directly paid by him. And those are not my polls, those are official Chicago polls. But when you speak to the average Palestinian and you go in depth, whether Palestinians in the diaspora or at home, there is this thirst for shifting towards a strategic struggle, shifting towards a path to liberation, a path to freedom that everybody wants. The main question that people have is, and this is the challenge of imagination, is what is that strategy? Who's investing in that strategy? How do we build how do we build that? How do we get there? And that's the big gap people have. And so people want to feel, or people have felt during this genocide and before that during the Sheikh Jarrah uprising, that there is a sense of possibility, that there is solidarity, that something is changing, that Palestinians have more power and agency. And they want to figure out how to turn that into political power that moves them towards liberation because they think that's the only path out, but they haven't figured out how to go from here to there. So that's a crucial thing. I think that's the question every Palestinian and anyone who cares about Palestine needs to answer is how do we go from simply trying to survive to a sophisticated strategy that ends Israeli domination over our lives? And how do we make that a possibility? Now, that should be, and I'll end by this, that should be the responsibility of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That's what they're paid for. That's what they were established to achieve. Since I was born, since 1988, they had pretty much given up on that and taken a different route. And so they stopped trying to answer that question. And instead, they've tried to, they've moved towards Oslo and that framework. And that's why and they're not allowing anyone to replace them. There's no democratic process to replace them. Anybody that tries to challenge their strategy is arrested or killed by them or by the Israelis. And that's why we're stuck. And so this is the key thing, is how do we get unstuck in this moment?
Thank you very much for that and centering in on that crucial question. I think it is a great place to wrap up this conversation. I really want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and for everyone who tuned in and who engaged with our speakers as well. We really appreciate your insights and the generosity of your time. Thanks again, everyone, and please continue to follow the work of Arab Center Washington, D.C. at arabcenterdc.org. Have a great day.